Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I am here with my review and discussion for The Black Witch by Laurie Forrest. So I know it's super irritating to have to watch a disclaimer before a video, but I actually am going to include a very brief one before I actually get into my thoughts on the book, because I do want to address some of the controversy or drama surrounding this book, because I do think it is relevant to the review. So just very briefly, the first thing I had really heard about this book was just this general impression that a lot of people had called it really sexist and horribly racist, and it was just getting a lot of bad press. So of course it wasn't on my radar as something I wanted to pick up. And then I started hearing some other reviews that were calling this book an examination of those prejudices and that it was actually a very powerful read. And specifically, I read this one review on Goodreads from Emily May, and I'm sure if you guys have spent any amount of time on Goodreads, you probably know who Emily is. She does really great, thoughtful, and well-written reviews on all of the books she reads. And I really trust her opinion. So after reading what she said about the way the author actually shows these prejudices in order to critique them, I decided, okay, I have to read the book for myself and form my opinion about it. And it turns out that a big part of the reason that the book was getting such awful reviews, that it had such a low rating on Goodreads, is that a lot of people were rating it 1 star who hadn't even read it. They were going off of 1 or 2 very prominent book bloggers and reviewers who had denounced this book as offensive because it showed offensive material that it then criticized. They were just saying that since it showed this racism and sexism, then the book was racist and sexist. And I'm also going to link Emily's review down below in case you guys are interested in that. But I actually felt very similar to what she said in her review. And like Emily, I'm going to say that I totally understand if people don't want to read a book that shows racism or sexism or homophobia or any kind of prejudice at all, even when the book then criticizes it and uses it as social commentary. I know that some people just don't want to put themselves through that, and that is totally valid. I know a lot of people like to read books to escape from the problems our world has, and God knows we have enough of them, so I totally understand if you don't want to encounter those in fiction. I personally think that one of the fantastic things about fantasy as a genre, and fiction in general, is that by showing some of these things, I think it prevents us from becoming desensitized to it after encountering it in our world so often. And another thing to address is that the protagonist of this book definitely starts out as a bigoted, prejudiced, racist person with a lot of internalized misogyny as well. And again, I totally get that some people do not want to spend any amount of time in a character's head who believes those things. But I think that if we automatically call any book racist that shows a main character who starts out that way and then starts to grow and change, if we portray this character as irredeemable because of her environment, then God, what hope is there for our world, you know? I actually think by showing a main character who grows up in a very bigoted and prejudiced environment, who then goes on to not be that way after experiencing things in a different way, I think that can actually be a very positive thing. Because if we approach our society as a place where anybody who comes from that kind of environment, we can't save them, and I think it's going to be really difficult to actually make our world better. That's all I'm going to say about the controversy about this book. I'm not saying that everybody is going to have this experience reading the book. I totally understand if there are people who don't want to read this book, but this is my perspective based on what I read and how I interpreted it, and the fact that, for example, The Handmaid's Tale shows horrible sexism, but that book is not a sexist book. And that's kind of how I took this one. Okay, now on to the actual review of the book. So in The Black Witch, we follow our main character, Laurie Gardner, and she is part of a race that has in the past been subjugated and mistreated by other fantasy races. And they've sort of responded to that by becoming a very straight-laced and conservative and prejudiced against all other races group. Now, Laurie looks exactly like her grandmother, who was the Black Witch, like the greatest mage of her generation that led her people out of servitude and basically saved them. So Lauren looks exactly like her, but unfortunately she does not possess any of the magical ability that her grandmother did. The plot really kicks off when Lauren is sent to a magical university, and as she navigates the complicated relationships between her classmates and all of these different groups and races, she starts to realize that maybe her people's version of history is not the only one, and maybe it's not even the correct one. And all of this is set against the backdrop of a world that is constantly on the brink of war, and there's been an uneasy peace for a while now, but things are starting to shift, alliances are starting to change. At any moment this could all turn into another bloody conflict. So that's the basic setup for the book. And as far as the plot and pace goes, I ended up really enjoying the story and the direction it took. It started out really slow for the first maybe quarter of the book, and it was kind of taking me a while to get through it. But once we actually get to the university and there's a couple of big things that happen, and it really starts to pick up from there, and I really got invested in the story and the characters. I think the writing style did sort of contribute to the slow plot in that Laurie Forest has a very descriptive and specific writing style, and sometimes that was great because it really helped me to picture the environment, like these different locations and characters and sort of like the world building of this fantasy world. So in some cases that was really good, but it did kind of slow down the pace. You know, every page was so thick with description that it kind of made some parts of the book tedious. But then once I got past that first introductory chunk, things really started picking up and that writing style stopped bothering me. And actually, even though the first part of the book was such a slow read, by the time I got past it, like I just flew through this book. I read the last 400 pages over like 2 days or a day and a half or something. To speak more specifically about the world building, I really enjoyed it. I felt that it was really nuanced and detailed, and it really did feel like this was a world that could exist. You know, there were all of these complicated traditions and backstories and interweaving of folklore and science and magic, and it was just really, really interesting and well done. And I also really loved the way that as Lauren grows and changes and starts to become a more open-minded person, we as the reader get sort of a re-evaluated worldview, you know? Some of the world-building elements actually change and become more nuanced and detailed as Lauren starts to experience things in a different and more positive way. And I just really liked how the opening up of the world really mirrored Lauren as she started to question her teachings and to become more interested in finding the truth. Next, I'm going to talk about the characters, and this was one of the high points of the novel for me. All of the supporting characters were so well developed, even the ones who at first glance seemed more stereotypical or flat. Apart from the one or two sort of bad guys who unfortunately were very flat and one-dimensional, all of the supporting characters were just so interesting and had their own inner life, and it was great. Among the characters that we are supposed to find sympathetic, there really were no stereotypes. Like, there was no fantasy group of people or race or whatever you want to call it that was based on the fact that, oh, of course they're this way because the lupines are always this way or the elves are always this way. If we did kind of get that impression, it soon became challenged after that based on Lauren's experiences. Actually, at one point it seems like one of the important side characters is sort of being set up as a stereotype, and then it gets turned on its head because everyone basically replies like, oh no, that's just Diana. Like, all lupines aren't like that. She's just kind of nuts. And it's just so refreshing. And I also feel that Lauren as a main character had a very believable or realistic character arc. You know, her change of heart doesn't happen overnight. She doesn't, like, make one friend who's an elf and suddenly she's not a racist anymore, you know? And while that does make parts of this book really hard to read because you are stuck in the head of somebody who has just been brought up to be so dismissive of anyone who's not like her, I do think that that made this book ultimately more effective because her journey and her growth feels earned. And you know, she's not a perfect person. By the end of this book, it's not like she's suddenly the poster child of diversity and acceptance, but she has made so much progress, and you really feel that even though she hasn't completely changed her mind, she has changed for the better, and permanently, which is great. And also, all of the character relationships were so well done, like friendships and romantic relationships. All of the sort of side relationships or side romances were just so good. Like, I felt so invested in basically everything about these supporting characters. And romance doesn't completely take over the book. It's not even a very important part of the novel, in my opinion, but when it's there, I feel like it's well done and you really are interested in what happens. And the friendships were just so great and well done, especially among Lauren and her like core group of friends. I'm gonna be careful not to give any spoilers, but there's this one part where the girls have to sort of band together about this other woman who is in a horrible situation. And there's this part where Lauren and her roommates and a couple of other girls, it's like they're all from different groups and people who were raised to despise everyone else in this circle. And they all sort of come together in order to protect this girl who has been abused. And it was just such an emotional part for me. It's like a very short scene, but I choked up a little bit. Like, it was just so well written and you really felt connected to all of these girls, and like you could feel the protectiveness that women feel when they are like trying to protect one of their own. And just that whole girls banding together to like save each other from an outside threat is just like mood. It's just so important to me. Just to talk really quick about Lauren's romantic interest, like the side relationships, it doesn't ever take over the story. There's a lot of more important things going on, which I really appreciated. I also like the fact that her closest connection is not necessarily with the first guy who pays attention to her. That was kind of a nice change. I will say that as we go on, there's maybe a few too many like burning glances between her and the love interest, but it didn't detract too much from the story, so I wouldn't say it's necessarily like a deal breaker. And finally, like I alluded to earlier, I do think that the bad guys, or like the non-sympathetic characters, were the least developed out of all of them. They felt pretty one-dimensional, and it could have been nice to have a slightly more complicated villain. But that was really one of the only complaints I had. But altogether, I thought this book was really well crafted and ultimately thoughtful and enjoyable, despite it being hard to read at times because of the kind of content. I'm not going to necessarily tell everyone like, oh, everybody should run out and read this book because of the things I said at the beginning of the video, where it really depends on what you're looking for from the fiction you read. But I thought it was really well done. I thought the characters and the plot are just so important and well developed and pretty timely in our world today, and I ended up giving The Black Witch 4 stars. You guys should let me know if you have read this book, what you thought of it, and I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!